I'm Susie Welch, real estate agent licensed in Virginia and Washington, D.C., and I'm here to talk to you about the Earnest Money Deposit, which is something every buyer wants to keep in mind when making an offer to purchase a home. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is an Earnest Money Deposit, sometimes referred to as an EMD. An Earnest Money Deposit is required as part of the Virginia sales contract for a buyer to make a commitment for a certain amount of money to show that the offer that they're making is earnest or serious. This amount is usually somewhere in the range of 1% to 2% of the sales price. So for example, if you're purchasing a $500,000 home, the earnest money deposit will usually be somewhere in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. This is an amount that a buyer makes a commitment to when they're making an offer, and if that offer is accepted by the sellers, that amount is then paid by the buyer and held by the settlement agent until the contract goes to closing. So the second thing we're going to talk about is what happens to the earnest money once it's paid. When a contract is accepted, when a seller accepts an offer from a buyer, that's when the buyer actually pays that earnest money. It goes into what's called an escrow account or a holding account that's generally managed by the escrow agent or the settlement agent, whomever is going to be conducting the closing. That money is held there until settlement takes place, at which time it's applied towards the buyer's closing costs. So for example, if you made a $5,000 earnest money deposit and your closing costs end up being $10,000, that means you only need to bring an additional $5,000 to closing. If you made an earnest money deposit that ends up being more than your closing costs, the overage or the extra earnest money would be refunded to you at the time of closing. So the third thing to keep in mind when we're talking about earnest money deposits is there are some ways that you as the buyer could put your earnest money deposit at risk. Remember, we mentioned that an earnest money deposit is a way of demonstrating to the seller that your offer is earnest and that your intention to see the purchase of the home through to the finish is a serious intention. There are some ways throughout the process that would be valid reasons for a buyer to break the contract, but there are some other invalid reasons for breaking the contract, and those would put your earnest money deposit at risk. For example, to use an extreme example, if you just woke up tomorrow morning and decided you no longer wanted to purchase a home in Virginia, you wanted to move to Florida instead, that would not be a valid reason to cancel the contract. And something like that is a way that you could risk losing part or all of that earnest money deposit. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So in summary, the three things to keep in mind as a buyer when thinking about your earnest money deposit are: what is an earnest money deposit? What happens to that deposit once it's made in between contract and closing? And what are some ways that you could possibly put that earnest money at risk?